One source of annoyance and sometimes frustration when you're using a node as a server development environment is that you got to kind of keep remembering to restart node whenever you make a change to your server code. So here I'm running a little simple happy server, and you can see here I just invoked it with node happyserver.js, and it gives us the usual output, and we could send requests to it, and that should work just fine. Now I'm going to go and make a change to my source file for that server, presumably something more sophisticated than this, but I'm just going to add a couple of blank lines so that I've just changed the file. I could have actually added some code, but as you've experienced, as soon as you save that file out, nothing happens, right? So now I have one version of the program that's in my source code and a different version of the program that's running at the shell. So I want to show you a way to use a different tool for this than Node itself. There's another package that's available from npm called Nodemon, Node M-O-N, which is short for Node Monitor. And the idea here is that the Nodemon wrapper keeps an eye on the file that Node is trying to run, and when that file changes, it restarts it automatically. And I'm going to show you how to do that here, Nodemon. So now instead of just saying node, I'm saying Nodemon, and I'm running the same happyserver.js. And so far, it looks similar. You get a little bit of additional information here that tells you that Nodemon is actually doing something, in particular that it's watching what's going on when you make changes. Now I'm going to go back up here and make a change to my source file. I'll just delete those lines that I inserted before. And as soon as I hit the save, you'll notice down here in the lower window that it's going to automatically restart. It says restarting due to changes, starting node, happyserver.js. So now you can kind of fire and forget the actual server running here in a shell, and every time you make a change to your source code, it's going to just restart that server. Super helpful, avoids lots of frustration where you sit around scratching your head wondering why something that you've changed in your source code isn't actually showing up in the behavior of the program, and then you realize, after 5 minutes of beating your head against the desk, that it's just the fact that you forgot to restart the program. This takes care of that problem. Now, one way to set this up is to use, instead of having to do these commands directly where you give the specific information about running node or nodemon, you can actually set up your package.json file to have kind of convenient little shortcuts in it that let you run these commands in various ways conveniently during the development cycle. So, for example, I may want to still be able to just run the node-based happy server directly as I have been. And what I've done is I've set up some scripts in the package.json file that let me do that. So I can use yarn and then run a script called server. And what's going to happen is, you can see here, I'm using yarn, and yarn has this built-in capability that runs programs that are specified inside the package.json file. It tells me that yarn's running, and then it shows me the command that it's going to execute. And now I'm using the happy server as we have been, with just running from node. And now if I make changes to my source file, as we saw before, it doesn't do anything to the server itself. But if I stop this, and then I'm going to run a different yarn server :dev for development, and I've defined that instead to run Nodemon and run the happy server. And now if I go back up here and make a change to my source file again, you'll see that when I save the file out, it's going to restart the server program again. So how do we define those things? Well, let's take a look at package.json. Here it is. The scripts section is something you might not have seen before, but this is another legitimate section to put into your package.json file that allows you to specify these kind of nice shortcuts to run things at the command line. So I've defined in this scripts object something with a key of server, and what that's going to do when I say yarn server is run this command, node happyserver.js. And when I say server dev, this is just kind of a common convention in package.json files to include variations of these commands by saying colon and something. So you might have server dev for development and server test and server production or something like that. But for development, I'm going to run Nodemon and use that to monitor my happyserver.js and continue to restart that program whenever I make changes to that source file. Now, you may or may not have Nodemon installed on your machine, but one way to to make sure that it's present is to include it in the package.json file itself. So again, if you haven't looked in a lot of detail at what's in this file, you can see that there's kind of two sections that list modules that have been installed in this working directory. So the one called Dependencies are the modules that need to be present sort of in order to run the thing you're developing. So all of these things have to be present in order to run the Happy server. So Happy itself, the connects layer, the objection layer, the Postgres database connection thing. So those have to be there at runtime. But you can also have the package.json file help you install tools that you're going to use at development time. And those are in a different section called Dev Dependencies. And here's where I've actually installed Nodemon. So this is going to ensure that when you start using this package.json file, that when you type that yarn command and do the default installation of modules, it's going to include Nodemon as well as Prettier here, which is a code formatting tool. So these things are just useful at development time and don't have to be present when you're going to run this thing. So you don't have to list them up here, which would cause those additional modules to be packaged with your software. You just put them in the Dev Dependencies section, and then they're only installed for you to use during development. When Nodemon gets installed here, it's actually going to be installed in kind of an odd place in the file system. Let me show you where that is. If I go back to my shell here and stop my server, we've got the node modules directory. And inside of this node modules directory, there's going to be a subdirectory called .bin, which is usually the Unix convention for where you put binaries. And we'll see that inside of that thing is where Nodemon actually got installed to, right here. And that's actually a symbolic link to a different location in the node modules directory. And the convention that the architects of Node chose to embrace here was to have this .bin directory as kind of a place where they collect together all of the things inside node modules that are executable into one spot. So you can actually run this directly. You can say node modules .bin nodemon and then happyserver.js as we've been doing. So that's going to run Nodemon just like we've had, but that's really a clunky path to have to type in. So when you create in your package.json file an entry in this scripts section, the shell that's executed when you run one of these scripts has added to its path variable the path to that .bin directory. So behind the scenes, Yarn kind of just sets that up for you so that it runs properly without having to use that ./nodemodules/.bin nonsense. If you're an NPM aficionado, instead of using Yarn, you need to use npm run and then the server, say dev, in order to start that up. So you can use either Yarn or npm. npm just, you have to add that run command, whereas you can kind of think of that as the default for Yarn without any other command in there. It's going to run the script with that name.